most vulnerable group generally is civilians, because it's the civilian areas which are being targeted for bombardment by the regime and by its allies. They've been subjected to barrel bombs, to chlorine gas, to starvation sieges. So civilians which are living in the areas which are liberated by the state are in general the most vulnerable groups, but of course there's also different vulnerabilities within that. Women, for example, have specific issues related to them in terms of their vulnerability to sexual and gender-based violence. You have elderly people which are extremely vulnerable for the issue that they cannot flee areas which are under attack very easily. Children, of course, which are suffering massive trauma because of what they're witnessing, need special protection and special interventions to help their needs. Groups which are part of minorities, religious or ethnic minorities, also face specific vulnerabilities, especially when they've been targeted by groups such as the Islamic State. I think it's very important to recognise that in 2011, at the beginning of the protest movement, there was a lot of unity amongst different communities amongst Syria. So, for example, people from rural and urban areas which have very different lifestyles and often didn't know each other prior to the revolution participated together. The protest movement was inclusive of men and women. It included people from all socio-economic backgrounds. It included people from all of Syria's diverse ethnic groups and religious groups. So you had Arabs and Kurds, Sunni, Shia, Alawis, Christians, all participating within this movement. We're in a situation now where the country is completely fragmented, and we need to understand this as a specific policy and process that was provoked primarily by the regime, but also by its international backers. For example, we've seen the process of sectarianisation of the conflict. One of these reasons has been in the differential treatment that the regime has given to Sunni majority communities, whereas minority communities faced easier treatment from the regime. So, for example, at protests, minority communities often faced tear gas to repress the protests, whereas in Sunni communities they often faced bullets, mass arrests, torture, detention. Another issue in that separation and the sectarianisation, of course, was the intervention of Iran, which is a Shia power intervening into a majority Sunni conflict. So for those who wanted to portray the conflict through sectarian lens, they had a very easy excuse to do that. So there's lots of different issues that have contributed to this breakdown, but I think what we need to understand is that these divisions that happened were a result of political circumstance. Before the revolution, people were living together within Syria, but because of the deliberate policies of the state and its international backers, you now have a lot of separation between different communities. The primary issue for Syrians to be able to return to Syria is to have peace, stability and security. There is no way that anyone will return to Syria whilst barrel bombs are falling on residential areas and communities. This is impossible. I also think that for the vast majority of refugees, they will be unable to return to the country if the regime stays in place. The main reason for that is because they know that as opposition activists or as members of dissenting communities, they will be targeted for repression by the regime. Homs came back under regime control, I think it was 2014, but still the vast majority of Homs's population did not return. And we know that when the regime has taken control of certain areas, it has been arresting people, sending people to prison, or sending many men to the front lines to fight. So for many people it's a security issue. As long as the regime stays in place, they cannot return. But we also need to remember that the regime does not want these people to return, because it knows that these are communities that it can never rule by consent. It can only rule by force, and whether it has the power and the ability to do that with its international backers in the long term, it's very doubtful.